The night 17 waitresses lost their jobs, the only woman who broke the rules was the only one who deserved to stay. Caleb Whitmore believed every successful empire rested on discipline, and discipline began with silence. Inside Whitmore House, the most exclusive private restaurant in downtown Chicago, silence was never awkward. It was polished into the marble floors, reflected in the crystal chandeliers, and woven into the tailored uniforms worn by every employee. Guests paid thousands of dollars for reservations that couldn't be purchased with money alone. Politicians, judges, athletes, business icons, and celebrities gathered beneath warm amber lights where every table was separated by just enough distance to protect whispered conversations from curious ears. Nobody came here simply for steak or wine. They came because Caleb Whitmore owned the room before he ever stepped inside it. At exactly 6:30 p.m., Maya Ellison adjusted the sleeves of her black uniform in the employees' locker room. The stitching near her left wrist had been repaired by hand the night before after the fabric finally gave out from months of careful washing. Her polished black shoes were older than most of the restaurant's newest employees, but they still shined under the fluorescent lights because she spent 15 minutes every morning making them look respectable. Respect, she believed, was sometimes the only thing poverty couldn't steal. She slipped a folded hospital invoice back into her purse before locking the metal door. The balance stared back at her one last time before disappearing beneath the zipper. $8,412. Every double shift mattered. Every tip mattered. Every hour inside Whitmore House meant another small payment toward her younger brother's treatment. Losing this job wasn't an option. Around her, the other waitresses whispered nervously while fixing their hair and checking lipstick in the mirrors. They weren't talking about customers. They were talking about him. Caleb Whitmore had returned from New York that afternoon after nearly 3 weeks away. Whenever he returned, someone usually disappeared. A hostess who smiled too long. A bartender who poured the wrong vintage. A manager who overlooked one broken rule. Nobody argued with his decisions because nobody stayed long enough to tell the story twice. Maya had never actually spoken to Caleb. She'd only seen him twice from across the dining room. Tall, impeccably dressed, calm enough to make everyone else uncomfortable. The kind of man who never needed to raise his voice because every person around him feared disappointing him more than they feared being yelled at. Before the dinner service began, the restaurant manager gathered the entire staff beside the wine cellar. His smile looked forced. "Mr. Whitmore expects perfection tonight," he announced. "Remember the 3 rules. Do not speak unless addressed. Do not interfere with guest interactions. Do not create unnecessary attention. If something happens, security handles it, not you." Several employees nodded immediately. Maya remained quiet, repeating the rules in her head while tying her apron. She understood why rules existed. She also understood that life had a habit of creating moments no handbook could predict. At precisely 7 o'clock, the heavy front doors opened. Luxury vehicles lined the curb outside as elegantly dressed guests entered beneath golden lights and soft piano music. Expensive watches caught reflections from crystal glasses, while servers glided silently across polished hardwood floors, carrying silver trays balanced with practiced precision. Maya welcomed her first table with a warm smile, carefully poured sparkling water into waiting glasses, and disappeared exactly as she had been trained to do. Invisible, efficient, forgettable. From the second-floor balcony overlooking the dining room, Caleb Whitmore stood with his hands resting lightly on the polished railing. His charcoal suit looked almost black beneath the warm lighting, and his expression revealed nothing as his sharp blue eyes moved slowly across every table, every employee, every tiny mistake others never noticed. He wasn't watching the guests. He was studying the people who served them. Because Caleb Whitmore had never believed character revealed itself when everything went according to plan. Character revealed itself the moment someone had to choose between following the rules and doing what was right. The dinner service unfolded with the flawless rhythm of a luxury watch, every movement rehearsed until it appeared effortless. Silver trays floated between tables, wine glasses caught the glow of chandeliers, and soft jazz drifted through the room without ever demanding attention. Maya Ellison moved through the dining room exactly as she had been trained, her posture straight, her expression warm but restrained, never lingering longer than necessary. She had learned that the wealthiest people often noticed the smallest details while pretending not to notice the people serving them. For nearly 2 hours, everything seemed perfect. Orders arrived on time. Guests laughed quietly over expensive bottles of wine. Business deals were sealed with discreet handshakes. From above, Caleb Whitmore remained almost motionless on the balcony, occasionally exchanging a few quiet words with the restaurant manager before returning his attention to the floor below. Nobody could tell what he was thinking, and that uncertainty made everyone work just a little harder. Maya was delivering fresh coffee to a corner table when she noticed an elderly woman pushing a janitorial cart through the side hallway. Her gray maintenance uniform contrasted sharply against the polished elegance surrounding her. She kept her eyes lowered while carefully replacing a decorative planter that had been moved during a private event earlier that afternoon. Maya had seen her before. Her name was Mrs. Evelyn Brooks. She had worked overnight maintenance for years and always greeted every employee with the same gentle smile, even when few people returned it. Tonight, however, Mrs. Brooks looked unusually tired. She paused briefly, pressing one hand against her lower back before continuing toward the hallway that connected to the private dining suites. Maya wanted to offer to help carry the heavy cleaning supplies, but another table signaled for service, and duty pulled her in the opposite direction. The restaurant manager intercepted Maya near the kitchen entrance. His voice remained low, but his tone carried unmistakable tension. Private party arriving in 2 minutes. Table 12 is your section. Stay alert. No mistakes. Maya nodded immediately. She recognized several faces as the new guests entered. Expensive tailored suits, designer dresses, security personnel waiting discreetly outside the entrance, and the effortless confidence of people accustomed to getting exactly what they wanted. Conversations throughout the restaurant softened almost instinctively as the group settled into their seats. They laughed loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, treating the elegant dining room as though it belonged exclusively to them. Maya approached with menus and welcomed them politely. Most barely acknowledged her existence. One guest accepted the menu without making eye contact. Another continued speaking into his phone while she poured water. She had experienced worse. She simply smiled and stepped away. Minutes later, as appetizers were being served across the dining room, Mrs. Brooks reappeared near the private hallway carrying a small bucket and fresh linen towels. She moved carefully, avoiding guests while trying to remain invisible. Suddenly, one member of the private party pushed back his chair without looking behind him. The movement caught the edge of Mrs. Brooks's bucket. Water splashed across the polished floor, and a few drops landed on the polished leather shoes of the man beside him. Silence spread faster than the spilled water. Mrs. Brooks immediately bent down, her hands trembling as she reached for the towels. "I am so sorry, sir," she said softly. "It was an accident." Instead of accepting the apology, the guest stared down at his shoes with obvious irritation before glancing around the room as though searching for an audience. Several conversations nearby faded completely. Other waitresses froze where they stood, remembering the restaurant's rules. Do not interfere. Security handles problems. Not you. The restaurant manager took one hesitant step forward but stopped almost immediately, his eyes darting toward the balcony, where Caleb Whitmore still watched in complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Maya stood only 20 feet away, holding a silver tray with fresh dessert plates balanced carefully in both hands. She looked at the frightened elderly woman kneeling beside the spilled water, then toward the balcony where Caleb's unreadable gaze remained fixed on the scene below. For the first time that evening, the restaurant no longer felt warm. It felt like a courtroom waiting for someone to decide whether compassion was more dangerous than disobedience. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks lowered her head even farther as she reached for the damp towel, her weathered hands shaking from equal parts embarrassment and exhaustion. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. After nearly 40 years of cleaning schools, offices, and restaurants, she knew that apologizing was often easier than trying to explain an accident. Around her, polished leather shoes remained perfectly still while expensive watches glimmered beneath the chandeliers. The guest whose shoes had been splashed looked down with visible annoyance, brushing an invisible speck of water from the edge of his trouser leg. "Do you people ever pay attention?" he asked, his voice calm enough to avoid becoming a scene, but loud enough for nearby tables to hear every word. Mrs. Brooks looked up only long enough to whisper another apology before reaching for the overturned bucket. The restaurant manager finally stepped closer, but instead of helping her stand, he spoke through a strained smile directed toward the guest. "Please accept our sincere apologies, sir. We will handle this immediately." His words were polished. His actions were not. He remained standing while the 72-year-old woman struggled to collect the scattered towels from the marble floor. Several guests quietly returned to their conversations, relieved that someone else was responsible for the uncomfortable moment. Others pretended not to notice at all. The waitresses remained frozen exactly where they had stopped, their training louder than their conscience. Every one of them understood the rules. Intervention meant attention. Attention invited discipline. Discipline usually ended with unemployment. Maya Ellison tightened her grip on the silver tray until her fingertips turned, pale beneath her dark skin. She could almost hear her younger brother's voice reminding her to stay practical. Keep the job. Pay the bills. Survive another week. The hospital invoice waiting inside her locker suddenly felt heavier than ever. One reckless decision could erase months of sacrifice. She looked toward the balcony again. Caleb Whitmore had not moved. His face remained unreadable, neither approving nor condemning what unfolded beneath him. The uncertainty was almost worse than anger. If he had simply ordered security to intervene, everyone would know what to do. Instead, he watched, quietly, patiently, as though measuring something invisible. Mrs. Brooks attempted to stand while balancing the bucket in one hand, but her aching knees forced her back down again. A few guests shifted awkwardly in their seats. One woman looked away toward the window. Another slowly lowered her menu, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to become involved. Compassion, Maya realized, had become the rarest item on the evening's menu. The irritated guest sighed dramatically before extending one polished shoe toward the elderly woman. "You missed a spot," he said without raising his voice. The words landed far harder than a shout ever could. Mrs. Brooks stared at the shoe for a brief moment before looking down at the towel still resting in her trembling hands. The manager remained silent. Security remained silent. Every waitress remained silent. Maya felt something inside her refused to stay quiet any longer. She carefully set the silver tray onto the nearest service station before anyone could stop her. Her heartbeat echoed louder than the piano playing softly across the dining room. One step became two. Two became five. Every eye followed her as she crossed the polished floor with steady determination. The manager noticed first. His expression shifted from confusion to alarm. He gave a subtle shake of his head, silently pleading for her to stop before it was too late. Maya kept walking. She reached Mrs. Brooks and knelt beside her without hesitation. Instead of handing her another towel, Maya gently lifted the heavy bucket from the older woman's hands and placed it safely beside the wall. Then she offered both hands to help her stand. Mrs. Brooks looked at her with surprised eyes filled with quiet gratitude. Maya smiled softly before brushing a few drops of water from the elderly woman's sleeve. Finally, she turned toward the guest whose complaint had frozen the entire restaurant. Her voice remained respectful, calm, and remarkably steady. "Sir, she has already apologized. Please allow us to clean the floor. There is no reason for her to carry this moment any longer." The dining room fell into complete silence. Glasses remained suspended halfway to lips. Conversations disappeared. Even the pianist stopped playing for a brief second before his hands froze above the keys. On the balcony, Caleb Whitmore slowly lifted his chin, his blue eyes settling fully on Maya for the first time that evening. Nobody could tell whether she had just saved her dignity or ended her career. The guests studied Maya Ellison for several long seconds, almost amused that someone wearing a simple black waitress uniform had interrupted him without permission. Around the dining room, nobody dared to breathe too loudly. The soft music had stopped completely, leaving only the faint hum of the climate control system and the distant clink of crystal somewhere near the kitchen. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks remained beside Maya, her shoulders slightly hunched, unsure whether she should leave or continue apologizing. Maya gently squeezed the older woman's hand once, a quiet reassurance that required no words. The guest finally leaned back in his chair and gave a thin smile that never reached his eyes. "You are remarkably confident for someone serving dinner," he said. Maya met his gaze respectfully, but did not lower her own. "Confidence has nothing to do with it, sir," she answered calmly. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect. The words floated across the room with surprising gentleness. They were not loud. They were not confrontational. Yet somehow they carried farther than any raised voice could have. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. One elderly couple quietly nodded to themselves. A younger businessman slowly placed his fork onto his plate, no longer interested in his expensive meal. The restaurant manager felt sweat gathering beneath his collar. His mind raced through every possible consequence. He imagined tomorrow's headlines if an influential guest filed a complaint. He imagined Caleb Whitmore's disappointment. Most of all, he imagined Maya collecting her belongings before the night was over. He stepped forward quickly, forcing another practiced smile. "Miss Ellison," he said, trying to regain control of the situation, "please return to your section immediately. Mrs. Brooks, maintenance can finish here." Maya remained where she stood. She was not refusing an order out of defiance. She simply refused to walk away while the elderly woman still looked frightened. Mrs. Brooks quietly whispered, "It is all right, dear. I do not want you to lose your job because of me." Maya smiled gently. "A job can be replaced," she answered softly. "Your dignity cannot." The sentence settled over the dining room like a curtain. Even the guest who had complained seemed momentarily surprised by the quiet certainty in her voice. Nobody expected a lecture. Nobody received one. They simply witnessed a young woman choosing kindness over convenience. Above them, Caleb Whitmore slowly released one hand from the balcony railing. His expression remained impossible to read, but something subtle had changed in his eyes. He was no longer watching a disturbance. He was studying a decision. Years earlier, before Whitmore House had become one of the most exclusive restaurants in Chicago, Caleb's grandmother had worked double shifts cleaning office buildings after raising him alone. He still remembered watching strangers walk past her as though she were invisible. She used to tell him that wealth could purchase comfort, but never character. At the time, he had dismissed the words as sentimental wisdom from another generation. Standing on the balcony now, he unexpectedly heard her voice again as clearly as if she were standing beside him. Down below, the guest cleared his throat and straightened his jacket. "Perhaps your employee needs additional training," he said while looking toward the manager rather than Maya. "She appears confused about her responsibilities." Before the manager could answer, a calm voice echoed from above. "No." Every head turned instantly toward the balcony. Caleb Whitmore began descending the wide staircase one measured step at a time. There was no hurry in his pace and no anger on his face. That made the silence even heavier. Employees instinctively straightened their posture. Security personnel discreetly stepped aside. Guests who had never stood for anyone quietly rose from their chairs without realizing they had done so. Caleb crossed the dining room until he stood only a few feet from Maya and Mrs. Brooks. He looked first at the spilled water that had already been cleaned, then at the folded towels, then at the elderly maintenance worker whose tired hands still trembled slightly. Finally, his blue eyes settled on Maya. Neither of them spoke. The room waited. The manager waited. The guest waited. Every waitress felt her heartbeat pounding against the quiet. Caleb slowly turned away from Maya and looked across the dining room at every employee wearing the same black uniform. His voice remained calm, controlled, and unmistakably clear. "I have spent years teaching everyone in this room to follow rules," he said. "Tonight I learned that some people have memorized the rules so well that they forgot why decent people create them in the first place." The words settled over the dining room with the weight of a final verdict. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for a glass or lifted a fork. Even the kitchen staff standing just beyond the swinging doors remained perfectly still, listening. Caleb Whitmore slowly walked past Maya Ellison without acknowledging her immediately. Instead, he stopped beside Mrs. Evelyn Brooks. The elderly maintenance worker looked as though she wanted to disappear into the polished marble beneath her feet. Her hands remained folded together, and she avoided looking directly at him. Caleb spoke with a quiet respect that surprised everyone in the room. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, "how many years have you worked in this building?" She hesitated before answering. "Almost 12 years, sir." Caleb nodded once. "And before this?" She smiled faintly, embarrassed by the attention. "Cleaning schools, hospitals, and office buildings. Nearly 40 years altogether." Caleb remained silent for a moment, as though calculating something far more valuable than money. Then he extended his hand toward her. Several guests blinked in disbelief as the owner of one of the most exclusive restaurants in Chicago helped the elderly woman straighten the wrinkles in her uniform sleeve instead of allowing her to apologize again. "Thank you," he said simply. "You have spent 4 decades helping people enjoy places they never stopped to appreciate." Mrs. Brooks's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled with quiet dignity. Around the room, guests lowered their eyes. Some suddenly found the white tablecloths far more interesting than the conversation they had interrupted. Caleb turned slowly toward the manager. The man's carefully rehearsed confidence had completely disappeared. "Tell me," Caleb asked evenly. When Mrs. Brooks struggled to stand, "Why did you not offer your hand?" The manager swallowed hard. "Sir, I was trying to avoid disturbing the guests." Caleb tilted his head slightly. "Interesting. And which guest would have been disturbed by kindness?" No answer came. The silence itself became the answer. Caleb looked across the dining room until his eyes rested on every waitress wearing the same black uniform as Maya. Some stared at the floor. Others fought back tears. None of them were cruel people. They were simply frightened people. Caleb understood the difference, but he also understood that fear repeated often enough eventually becomes habit. He spoke clearly enough for every employee to hear. "Every one of you saw an elderly woman carrying more weight than anyone should carry alone. Every one of you saw her apologize for an accident. Every one of you waited for permission to be decent." His voice never rose, yet every sentence seemed to echo against the crystal and marble surrounding them. He looked toward Maya at last. She remained beside Mrs. Brooks with calm composure, still uncertain whether she would be praised or dismissed. Caleb studied her for several quiet seconds. "Miss Ellison," he said, "did you know you violated my rules?" Maya nodded honestly. "Yes, sir." "Did you believe there would be consequences?" "Yes, sir." "Then why did you do it?" Maya took a slow breath before answering. "Because if protecting someone costs me my job, I can find another job. If I walk away from someone who needs kindness, I do not know how I would find myself again." The answer lingered in the air long after she finished speaking. Caleb did not smile. He rarely smiled. Instead, he turned back toward the rows of employees whose anxious faces reflected the chandelier light above them. "The purpose of rules," he said, "is to protect people. The moment rules begin protecting comfort instead of character, they have failed." He paused before delivering the sentence nobody expected to hear. "Every waitress on duty tonight is relieved of her position, effective immediately." Gasps swept across the dining room. Several employees stared at him in disbelief. One waitress quietly covered her mouth. Another looked toward the exit as though trying to understand what had just happened. The manager himself looked almost relieved that Maya would finally share the same fate as everyone else. Caleb allowed the silence to settle before adding one final sentence. With one exception, every eye in the room turned toward Maya Ellison as Caleb faced her once again. "Miss Ellison," he said calmly, "you are the only waitress in this restaurant who remembered that humanity comes before procedure. Tomorrow morning, you will report directly to my office. Your employment here is not ending. It is changing. Because the person who broke my rules is the only person who truly understood what they were supposed to protect." The announcement echoed through Whitmore House long after Caleb Whitmore finished speaking. No one protested. No one argued. The employees understood that once Caleb made a decision, it became as permanent as carved stone. The dismissed waitresses quietly removed their aprons and name tags while guests watched with expressions that shifted from surprise to reflection. For the first time that evening, the elegant restaurant no longer felt like a place built upon wealth alone. It felt like a place where invisible values had suddenly become visible. Maya Ellison remained standing beside Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, uncertain whether to feel relieved or overwhelmed. She had expected to lose everything. Instead, she had been singled out in front of the city's most influential people, and she had no idea what tomorrow would bring. Caleb looked toward the restaurant manager once more. "Tonight's dinner service is over," he said calmly. "Every guest's meal is complimentary." Several guests immediately attempted to object, insisting they could easily afford the bill, but Caleb gently raised one hand. "This evening was not about food," he continued. "It was about remembering that the quality of a restaurant is measured by how it treats the people wearing uniforms, not only the people wearing tailored suits." Silence answered him again. Even the guest who had complained earlier lowered his eyes. His confidence noticeably diminished. He slowly stood from his chair and looked toward Mrs. Evelyn Brooks. His apology was quiet and sincere. "Ma'am, I allowed my frustration to become disrespect. I am sorry." Mrs. Brooks smiled with the grace that only years of hardship could teach. "Thank you," she answered softly. "That means more than you know." Caleb nodded once, satisfied not because someone had admitted fault, but because respect had finally replaced pride. He then turned toward security. "Please arrange transportation home for Mrs. Brooks this evening. She has worked enough for one day." Mrs. Brooks immediately protested. "Sir, I can still finish my shift." Caleb shook his head gently. "You have already given this building 12 years. Tonight, let us take care of you instead." Tears quietly formed in the corners of her eyes as she accepted the kindness with humble gratitude. Maya watched the exchange without saying a word. Something about the moment reminded her of her own mother, who had spent years working 2 jobs before illness took her far too early. She remembered watching strangers walk past her mother every day without ever asking whether she was tired. Looking at Mrs. Brooks now, Maya realized that dignity often arrived through the smallest gestures. Caleb finally faced Maya. Directly. "Tomorrow, 9 o'clock. My office." She nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir. Do not be late." "I will not." There was no smile between them, yet the conversation carried an unexpected sense of mutual understanding. Caleb walked toward the front entrance, greeting several longtime guests with polite handshakes before disappearing through the revolving doors into the cool Chicago evening. One by one, the remaining guests quietly left as well. Many paused beside Mrs. Brooks before departing, offering warm words they probably should have spoken years earlier. Others thanked Maya personally before stepping outside. The atmosphere had changed completely. Wolf had entered the restaurant that evening wearing expensive watches. It left carrying a lesson money could never purchase. Nearly an hour later, the dining room stood empty except for a handful of employees finishing the final cleanup. Maya carefully folded her apron before placing it inside her locker. She expected to feel victorious, but instead she felt uncertain. The security of routine had disappeared, replaced by questions she could not answer. What kind of position awaited her tomorrow? Why had Caleb chosen her? Had she truly earned his trust, or was she about to face a test even greater than the one she had already passed? As she gathered her purse, she noticed the folded hospital invoice still resting inside. For the first time in months, she looked at the total without feeling completely defeated. Nothing about the number had changed, but something inside her had. Before leaving, she walked past the quiet dining room one final time. The polished marble floors reflected the soft chandelier light exactly as they had earlier that evening, yet everything somehow looked different. The building itself had not changed. The people inside it had. And somewhere beyond the dark glass windows overlooking the city, Caleb Whitmore was already preparing for a conversation that would reveal he had been searching for someone like Maya Ellison far longer than anyone inside Whitmore House could possibly imagine. At exactly 9 o'clock the following morning, Maya Ellison stood outside the solid walnut doors, leading to Caleb Whitmore's private office. The hallway was lined with framed black and white photographs showing the early years of Whitmore House, long before it had become one of Chicago's most exclusive dining destinations. She noticed something unexpected in nearly every photograph. The focus was never on famous guests or expensive celebrations. Instead, the pictures featured chefs laughing together in the kitchen, servers preparing tables before sunrise, dishwashers standing shoulder to shoulder after closing, and maintenance workers smiling beside freshly polished floors. It felt less like a gallery of success and more like a quiet tribute to people whose names the public would never know. A receptionist opened the office door with a welcoming smile. "Mr. Whitmore is ready for you." Maya stepped inside, expecting intimidating luxury. Instead, the office felt surprisingly understated. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago skyline, while shelves filled with history books and family photographs softened the modern space. There were no oversized displays of wealth, no elaborate decorations demanding attention. Caleb Whitmore stood near the window holding a cup of black coffee. He turned as Maya entered and motioned toward a chair. "Please sit." She thanked him quietly and took a seat, placing her purse carefully beside her feet. Caleb remained standing for a moment before speaking. "You have probably spent the entire night wondering why I asked you here." Maya nodded honestly. "Yes, sir. He sat across from her instead of behind his large desk. It was a small decision, but one that immediately changed the atmosphere. This was not an interrogation. It was a conversation. Caleb folded his hands together. When I purchased Whitmore House 12 years ago, I made a promise to myself that no employee would ever be treated as invisible inside these walls. He paused briefly before looking toward one of the framed photographs hanging beside the bookshelf. It showed an elderly woman wearing a faded housekeeping uniform, smiling while holding the hand of a young boy. Maya noticed the resemblance immediately. "My grandmother," Caleb said softly, following her gaze. "She raised me after my parents died." His voice remained calm, yet every word carried quiet affection. "She cleaned office buildings every night for almost 30 years. People walked past her every day without learning her name. Some thanked her. Most never noticed she existed." Maya listened without interrupting. Caleb continued. "When I was 16, I asked her why she always smiled after working such long hours. She told me something I never forgot. She said, 'The way people treat those who serve them reveals who they become when nobody is trying to impress anyone.'" He smiled faintly, almost to himself. "I built this restaurant because I wanted excellence. Somewhere along the way, excellence became confused with obedience." Maya looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. "I did not mean to challenge your authority yesterday." Caleb shook his head gently. "You did not challenge my authority. You challenged my blind spot." The sentence surprised her more than anything he had said the night before. Caleb leaned back in his chair. "For several months, I have suspected that my managers had become more concerned with avoiding complaints than protecting people. I created policies to ensure professionalism. Instead, those policies slowly became excuses for silence." He opened a folder resting on the table between them. Inside were employee evaluations, guest feedback forms, and handwritten notes. "Yesterday was not an accident," he admitted. "I have been observing how this restaurant responds under pressure for weeks. Different situations, different people, different opportunities to choose character over convenience." Maya blinked with quiet surprise. Caleb looked directly at her. "Every employee passed inspections. Every employee memorized procedures. Yesterday, only one employee remembered the purpose behind them." He slid a single document across the table. Maya looked down. It was not a termination notice. It was an employment agreement for a newly created position, Director of Employee Culture and Guest Care. She looked back at Caleb, almost unable to believe what she was reading. "Sir," she said carefully, "I have never managed anyone." Caleb nodded. "That can be taught. Compassion cannot. Integrity cannot. The courage to stand alone cannot. Those qualities are far more difficult to hire." Maya sat silently, still absorbing the unexpected opportunity. Caleb offered one final thought before allowing her to answer. "Restaurants serve meals every day. Very few serve dignity. I intend for Whitmore House to become one of them." Maya Ellison did not reach for the agreement immediately. She read the title again, then the responsibilities listed beneath it, as though expecting the words to rearrange themselves into something more ordinary. Director of Employee Culture and Guest Care. It sounded impossible for someone who had spent the previous evening balancing serving trays and worrying about overdue medical bills. She looked up at Caleb Whitmore with quiet honesty. "There are people here with management degrees, years of experience, and far more knowledge than I have." Caleb folded his hands calmly. "Experience teaches people how to maintain a system. Sometimes it takes someone outside that system to recognize what it has forgotten." Maya lowered her eyes to the document once more. "What if I fail?" Caleb answered without hesitation. "Then we will learn from it. The only failure I cannot accept is pretending not to see another person's dignity." The certainty in his voice removed the fear from the room. It did not erase Maya's doubts, but it reminded her that leadership was not about never making mistakes. It was about refusing to ignore what mattered. She finally signed the agreement with steady hands. Caleb stood and extended his hand across the table. Maya accepted it, and for the first time since they had met, there was no invisible wall separating owner and employee. There were simply two people committed to building something better. During the following weeks, Whitmore House began changing in ways that surprised everyone. The new employee orientation no longer began with a list of rules. Instead, every new staff member first met the maintenance team, the dishwashers, the kitchen porters, and the overnight cleaning crew. Maya insisted that every employee learn every person's name before serving a single guest. Weekly meetings no longer focused only on customer satisfaction scores. They also included stories about acts of kindness witnessed throughout the restaurant. A server who stayed late to help a dishwasher. A chef who quietly prepared a meal for an employee working a double shift. A receptionist who arranged transportation for an elderly guest caught in a snowstorm. Slowly, the culture inside Whitmore House shifted. Procedures remained important, but people mattered first. Caleb watched the changes without interfering. He attended the meetings only occasionally, usually sitting quietly in the back of the room, while Maya led conversations with confidence that grew stronger each week. She never tried to sound important. She simply spoke with the same calm sincerity that had led her to help Mrs. Evelyn Brooks. One afternoon, nearly 2 months after that unforgettable evening, Maya was reviewing training materials when she noticed a familiar knock on her office door. Mrs. Brooks stepped inside, carrying a small tin wrapped with a blue ribbon. "I hope I am not interrupting," she said with her gentle smile. Maya stood immediately and welcomed her inside. "Never." Mrs. Brooks placed the tin on the desk. "Chocolate chip cookies," she explained. "My grandmother's recipe. I thought someone should thank the young woman who reminded an old lady that she was still worth standing beside." Maya felt her eyes begin to sting. "You never needed to thank me." Mrs. Brooks smiled warmly. "Perhaps not. But gratitude grows when it is spoken aloud." The two women shared coffee in the employee lounge instead of the executive office. Maintenance workers, cooks, hosts, and managers stopped by throughout the afternoon, joining the conversation naturally. No one seemed uncomfortable sitting beside anyone else anymore. Titles mattered less than they once had. As the weeks became months, word quietly spread beyond the restaurant. Guests returned not only because the food remained exceptional, but because they noticed something impossible to measure on a menu. Employees smiled differently. They listened more carefully. They treated one another with the same respect they offered. Every guest. Business magazines praised the restaurant's remarkable employee retention. Hospitality organizations invited Maya to speak about workplace culture. Whenever reporters asked Caleb Whitmore what strategy had transformed his business, he always gave the same answer. "We stopped hiring people only for their skills. We started protecting the values that skills alone cannot create." Maya never grew comfortable with public attention. She still arrived early every morning, greeted every employee by name, and occasionally carried coffee to the overnight maintenance crew before they finished their shifts. She understood something success could never replace. The moment people begin believing they are too important to notice those serving beside them, they have already started losing the very character that earned them respect in the first place. Nearly 1 year later, the anniversary of Whitmore House arrived without fanfare. There were no extravagant decorations, no public celebration, and no expensive marketing campaign announcing how much the restaurant had changed. Caleb Whitmore preferred results over speeches, and the results could now be seen in every quiet corner of the building. New employees greeted the overnight cleaning crew by name before beginning their shifts. Managers stepped forward without hesitation whenever someone needed help. Guests noticed small gestures that had become ordinary inside the restaurant, but extraordinary almost everywhere else. A server carried an umbrella to an elderly couple caught in the rain. A chef personally prepared a simple meal for a delivery driver who had worked through lunch. A dishwasher received applause after completing 20 years of service with the company. Respect had quietly become the most valuable item Whitmore House offered, and it never appeared on the menu. One crisp autumn evening, as golden leaves drifted along the sidewalks outside, Caleb stood once again on the second-floor balcony overlooking the dining room. The same marble floors reflected the warm chandelier light. The same piano melodies floated gently through the room. Yet the atmosphere felt completely different from the night that had changed everything. Below him, Maya Ellison moved through the restaurant, no longer carrying serving trays, but stopping often to encourage a new employee, greet returning guests, or thank someone working behind the scenes. She had become exactly what the position required, not because of authority, but because she never forgot where she started. Caleb quietly smiled to himself before walking downstairs. As he crossed the dining room, he noticed Mrs. Evelyn Brooks finishing her shift. She looked healthier now, her smile brighter than it had been that unforgettable evening. She had recently reduced her hours, and the company had expanded its employee assistance program so longtime staff members could receive additional support without asking for it. When she saw Caleb approaching, she laughed softly. "You still inspect the floors yourself?" she teased. Caleb glanced down at the polished marble beneath his shoes. "Old habits," he replied. Mrs. Brooks shook her head with a smile. "No, good habits." Maya joined them a moment later carrying 3 cups of fresh coffee. None of them stood above the others. The owner, the former waitress, and the maintenance worker shared a simple conversation while the restaurant continued serving hundreds of guests around them. Several employees passing by smiled naturally at the scene before returning to work. To anyone visiting for the first time, nothing about the moment seemed unusual. That was perhaps the greatest success of all. Kindness no longer looked exceptional. It had become normal. Before leaving for the evening, Caleb paused near the entrance where a framed photograph had recently been added to the wall. It was not a picture of celebrities dining inside Whitmore House or an award recognizing business excellence. Instead, it captured a simple moment. Maya helping Mrs. Brooks to her feet while a silver tray rested forgotten nearby. No dramatic poses. No staged expressions. Just one ordinary decision that changed the direction of countless lives. Beneath the photograph, a small bronze plaque carried a single sentence that every employee read before beginning work each day. Character is revealed in the moments when no rule tells you what to do. Guests often stopped to read the plaque before entering the dining room. Some smiled. Some quietly reflected. Many never realized that the sentence explained why the atmosphere inside Whitmore House felt different from anywhere else they had visited. Maya looked at the photograph one last time before switching off the lobby lights. She remembered the fear she had felt that night, the uncertainty, the impossible choice between keeping her job and protecting another person's dignity. Looking back, she understood that courage rarely feels heroic while it is happening. Most of the time, it simply feels like doing the only thing your heart will allow. Caleb locked the front doors, and together they stepped into the cool Chicago evening, where the city lights reflected across quiet streets, and another day came to a peaceful close. And on that night, just as on the night everything changed, the world remembered what dignity looks like. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, and sharing this video with someone who still believes that kindness and respect can change the world, one quiet decision at a time.